Hi, everybody. Thank you. Just so you know, there will be interpretation for this next segment, and the interpreters are over on the wall there, not on the wall, but at the wall. There will be interpretation in Spanish and French, and you can leave your, oh, give it to them in the back. And you leave your badge. Sorry, I'm losing my, my train of thought. Maria. Just so you know, there will be interpretation for this event, and one of our wonderful interpreters has their hands up on the side there. Please drop your badge off and you'll get some interpretation equipment. All right, everybody, how are we doing? Sorry, is everyone doing okay? All right, everybody stand up. I know I'm tired. Stand up. This is our almost to last session of the day. The next session's really short, and then we have a cocktail, so just remember. Everyone, shake your legs. Shake your other one. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. All right, and wiggle back to your chair. All right. Greetings, everyone. My name is Kristen Painemilla. I'm the Senior Vice President for the Center for Communities and Conservation at Conservation International, and also Chair of the IUCN Commission on Environment, Economics, and Social Policy. And we've been on a journey today to really look at the issues around the integration of human rights in the post-2020 framework. As we know, today is International Human Rights Day, a day that it's important, and it continues to be important, but we're still not achieving the targets we lay out there for human rights. And this second to last segment is really looking at the issues around financing. We've been talking a lot about the need for human rights, the highest level in the post-2020 framework, the need to have it in the operational framework, so we're actually accountable to it, and then the need to make sure that there's an inclusive process in the development of NBSAPs. But we also need to make sure that it is included in financing, and financing around how we move those targets forward. So we have a mixed panel today for this last session to have a little bit of reflection about what is needed. So I'm going to turn to Ramiro Batzin, who is the director of Batzin in Guatemala, an indigenous organization, but is also the chair, one of the co-chairs of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity. And there's a lot of discussion about resource mobilization. And we just talked about the issues of monitoring human rights prior to this session. So Ramiro, in the discussion by indigenous peoples regarding direct access to finance, what are the major issues that come about when we think about human rights or indigenous rights when we're looking at financing for indigenous peoples? What is needed and what are we missing?
Bueno, buenas tardes a cada uno de ustedes. Gracias a los organizadores por la invitación y hablar del tema de la financiación y el tema de los derechos es algo fundamental para los pueblos indígenas. En primer lugar, digamos, ¿qué necesitamos ver para el tema de la financiación y en este caso para la financiación directa? Uno de los temas es tener un enfoque de derechos. No puede haber una cooperación directa para los pueblos indígenas o la cooperación en general si no se reconocen los derechos. Para los pueblos indígenas, derechos fundamentales como el tema del territorio, ¿sí? Como el tema del consentimiento libre, previo e informado, y parados en el marco, digamos, del CBD, el tema de los conocimientos tradicionales. Son derechos fundamentales que se deben de reconocer para que la cooperación pueda tener realmente un impacto positivo. Otro de los temas que hay que analizar y empezar a ver es el tema del enfoque, ese modelo de desarrollo que realmente se está implementando, porque puede llegar una cooperación directa a los pueblos indígenas, pero si el enfoque del desarrollo, el enfoque de ese buen vivir que se va a implementar no está bien definido, la cooperación no va a tener el impacto que realmente queremos. Ahora que estamos hablando justamente de la financiación directa, hoy en la mañana platicábamos con varios colegas y decíamos cuál va a ser ese impacto de la cooperación, pero también cuál va a ser el impacto que esa cooperación va a generar en los pueblos indígenas, en esas comunidades, si no tenemos un modelo de desarrollo bien definido. Ya. Lo planteaba hace unos días de que es importante que la cooperación pueda construir sus líneas de cooperación para pueblos indígenas y para países en vías de desarrollo desde un modelo de la realidad, tiene que tomar en cuenta la realidad, las necesidades y los derechos. Porque si tenemos una cooperación que no está enfocada en reconocer los derechos y en la realidad que viven las comunidades, no vamos a tener el impacto que queremos, aunque la cooperación llegue. Incluso, digamos, podemos ir viendo cómo varias organizaciones que han tenido recursos y que no han podido desarrollarlos de manera adecuada, han tenido serios problemas. Entonces el tema de la cooperación tiene que verse desde ese enfoque, se tiene que ver el modelo de desarrollo, el Utzcaslemal o el vivir bien como le llamamos, porque desde ahí viene la parte de cómo va a ser la inversión. Para muchos pueblos indígenas también es importante ver el tema de lo monetario y lo no monetario. Hay temas que no tienen que ver necesariamente con recursos para promover desarrollo. Y ese modelo, digamos, que se desarrolla a nivel comunitario, ahora cuando tengamos recursos va a tener que tener una estrategia clara, una estrategia bien definida de cómo impactar a los pueblos indígenas. Si no, en lugar de impactar positivamente, podemos estar afectando al modelo de desarrollo que se está implementando en estos momentos. Sí, son temas y retos que tenemos tanto las organizaciones indígenas, los estados y los organismos internacionales. Debemos de tener una estrategia clara de inversión para que realmente dé los frutos que estamos esperando. Gracias.
Thank you, Ramiro. I think you highlight some important things. First and foremost, the respect and recognition for rights, and then looking at the issues around the cooperation, the rights, the reality of communities, and the issues around monetary and non-monetary items. I want to turn now to Ebony Holland with IIED, who has been working on looking at some of these issues and some of the gaps around financing. So I'd love for you to give us the broad brushstrokes, what's out there, what's not, and what's missing.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kristen, and huge thanks for having me on this exciting panel after a great day of events. It's really wonderful to be here. As Kristen says, I'm Ebony Holland. I'm the Nature Climate Policy Lead at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And for those who don't know us, we're a research and policy organisation or a think tank. And for 50 years, we've been working with local partners, grassroots organisations around the world to really amplify their priorities and their needs in different international forums, like at COPs, here, as we are here today. And a lot of my research and the research of my team is around looking at the system of nature and climate finance and working out how more decision-making, more finance can get down to the local level to support Indigenous peoples and local communities, local innovators and others. And it's in that context I'm going to just provide a few reflections. A lot of our work focuses on looking at the quantity of finance available at the local level, how good quality that finance is, and particularly how accessible it is. And when you look into these issues, it throws up a whole range of issues around transparency, around accountability, around eligibility criteria. And so I want to touch on a few pieces of research that I think are particularly pertinent to this discussion. Some of this research is from my organisation, but also it's from other partner organisations, and it's great that we have so many people working on this issue at the moment. So the first point is around the quantity of finance, and in fact there's no annual tracking of how much finance reaches the local level. It's an incredibly difficult thing to research because of how the international finance system and funders report on their financing. Nonetheless, we did some research last year specifically on climate finance, and what we found was that only 46% of adaptation finance that was committed at the international level is intended to give agency to Indigenous peoples, local communities and other local actors. What we found within that 46% was that there was very little evidence of local actors having full agency over how that funding is spent. And in fact, that funding itself, so of the 46%, only 1% of that went to Indigenous peoples and local communities. This is an issue that we're spending a lot more effort into researching at the moment. We're particularly extending this work into the nature finance space so that we can get a better sense across the climate and nature space exactly where the money is going. I do also want to point to some research that the Rainforest Foundation Norway and the Rights and Resources Initiative put out earlier this year. Which is also really telling, and what they found is that of $270 million US dollars in conservation funding, just 17% of that went to activities that specifically named Indigenous people or local community organisations. So I guess the point from mentioning these two pieces of research is that no matter how you kind of cut the research, no matter how much you look at the data, we're seeing fairly small amounts of very large commitments at the international level actually reaching the local level and truly getting behind the rights, the needs, the priorities of local communities and Indigenous peoples. I want to match that with some very recent analysis that we've done, which is looking at what the situation is at the local level and how much finance is being generated by local people and Indigenous communities. And actually, hot off the press just earlier this week, in collaboration with the Farmer Seed Network and with FoodThink, we put out some analysis which showed that farmers in China are making a really substantial contribution of their own money in order to adapt to climate change and also the loss of nature. And what that research found is that farmers in China spend 280 billion, that's billion with a B, per year adapting to climate change and nature loss. This is based on a survey of 200 farmers who, between them, on average, spent 20 to 40% of their annual income, which is around 2,900 per hectare per year, trialling and implementing ecological farming practices. And in fact, that increases to 60 to 80% when you move to more remote locations. This is quite a substantial finding. We're going to apply this on a global level to get greater insights. But what we're seeing is that the lack of funding at the international level getting down to the local level means that there's more expectation and more onus on local farmers in this case, but also local communities and Indigenous peoples more broadly to step up and put more of their funding into adaptation and tackling the nature crisis. The second point I'll just briefly mention as well is around some very exciting but very recent preliminary findings we've been working with IIFB on, in fact. And this is around the governance of funding, which is a really prickly issue and quite a difficult topic to also research because of transparency issues. What we have been doing with Ramiro's colleagues in IIFB is looking at the governance arrangements of some of the really large funds that are specifically looking to get funding to IPLCs. What we're finding is that there's quite low representation on the governance boards of some of those funds. On average, there's around 11% of the seats are occupied by IPLCs, and this is looking at 16 funds, which I'm more than happy to talk about in more detail later. And these 16 funds aim to deliver more than $2 billion to IPLCs. So there's a real gap in decision-making power and influence that IPLCs have over funding that's intended for them. There are some exceptions. One of the funds in particular has 88% of their board made up of Indigenous people and local community representatives. So there are some trends and there are some standouts in this space. But on the whole, the kind of representation at those very senior levels of decision making is quite low. There's quite a bit more to unpack in this space, but I think for the moment, in terms of just sharing with you some of the recent research findings, I'll leave it there. We've put out quite a bit of work that looks at recommendations around how this system can shift, what governance and funders could do to shift towards really approaches that put human rights at the centre. And I'd be particularly more than happy to talk about that during the Q&A session and what that means for the GBF as well. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ebony. I think you've given them some food for thought. And I think, you know, we have been hearing, no matter which way you slice the data, it's still saying pretty much the same thing, that not enough resources are getting to the ground compared to the commitments and what we're hearing on a global scale. So Maria, I'm going to turn to you. Maria DiGiano is with the Moore Foundation, and I would love to hear from her. The Moore Foundation has been part of one of the larger pledges, but hear from you about some of these issues that you're thinking about, that others are thinking about, and where you think this will head into the future.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you so much, and it's really a pleasure to be here and be part of this conversation and an opportunity to learn. As Kristen said, I'm with the Moore Foundation. I'm a program officer in the Andes Amazon Initiative at the Moore Foundation. And for those of you who don't know the Moore Foundation, we're one of the larger private foundations in the United States. I think over the past 20 years, we've deployed something like $4 billion in grants to over 2,000 types of organizations and grantees. And within the Andes Amazon Initiative, which began in 2001, we've deployed about 500 million, mostly focused on the creation and effective management of protected areas, which has also included indigenous territories in the Amazon basin. And we recently received renewed authorization from our board to continue this investment in the Amazon for the next 10 years, which is really exciting, in combination with the fact that the Moore Foundation is part of the Protect Our Planet Challenge, which did sign on to the pledge in Glasgow last year, which pledged $1.7 billion to conservation, forest tenure, led by indigenous peoples and benefiting indigenous peoples in local communities. Important to include local communities there too. So, you know, these spaces here are really important for us as donors to also learn about how we can be shifting our funding to meet this pledge and also the new priorities. And I think there's been a huge recognition, and I wouldn't say it's a change, I think it's just an increased recognition of the importance of indigenous peoples and local communities in conservation. There's so much more evidence out there. If you look at deforestation, biodiversity conservation, we know the importance of collective territories in protecting those resources. And so I think the pledge is a really important signal and evidence of this shift in the donor landscape to really recognize the importance of indigenous peoples and local communities. So how do we do this? That's the big question now. The pledge is out there. How is this going to be realized? And I think I've been thinking about it in two ways. One is the what, and the other is the how. And so if we talk about the what, I think that's a little bit of what Ramiro was getting to, is what are the priorities that we're hearing from indigenous peoples and local communities? So, for example, we're hearing about rights, the importance of secure rights, formal rights, but also ensuring the protection of those rights that are already formalized. We're hearing about livelihoods, well-being, food security, health, the resilience of cultures that are so integrated into biodiversity conservation is so linked with cultural resilience. And we're hearing a lot about territorial protection and defense as threats and violence mount against environmental defenders, especially those from indigenous and local communities. We need to be paying particular attention to that. So, and really our new strategy within the Andes Amazon Initiative is looking at how we can make a difference aligned with those priorities. But as a private foundation, we also have our own priorities, which are focused on avoiding the tipping point in the Amazon. That is our North Star, and so all of our priorities are aligned with that North Star. And our process of grant making is really one of co-creation and synergy, where we try to align the priorities of the foundation, which come from our founders and our board, the whole structure within a private foundation, and then align those with priorities of our grantees. So then the how. I think with the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Pledge, what I think has been so fascinating about this pledge is many times these pledges are made, they're sort of out there in space, nobody knows exactly what happens to them afterwards. I think there's been a real concerted effort on the part of those involved, on the part of many Indigenous peoples and local communities, to come together to grapple with how we make this a reality, and really an exercise of listening to one another to see how we can match our priorities and align the finance to meet those priorities. So I think this has been a really productive space, and I want to highlight that there are different kinds of changes that are needed for what I see from my perspective. So we have the scale of the changes needed at the level of the system. So that involves tenure reform, system change, resolving overlapping land conflicts, and that might not happen through direct access by Indigenous peoples and local communities. That might involve actions, strategic litigation, or policy reform, things like that. So we need to be clear on the what driving the how of how the funding is deployed. There's also a whole range of actions along strengthening institutions, and that might involve direct funding to Indigenous or local community organizations at a regional level. Many of those organizations are at the table now with donors discussing those priorities, which is really exciting. And then there are also community level actions, and that has been a long part of More Foundation's strategy of seeing how we can work directly with people within these territories to support sustainable natural resource management, things like that. And so private donors, bilaterals, multilaterals can all play a part in those spaces and scales that I just mentioned. And then how we do it is another question. So if we want to do system reform, maybe it's something about pooling different kinds of funding together. And we could learn a lot from some of the innovative mechanisms that are out there. The Moore Foundation has a long history of what are called project finance for permanence, where they pool donor funds like ourselves, other donors, with public funds to fund system-wide change for protected areas. And I think recently, just a couple of days ago, Canada made a huge commitment, $800 million for Indigenous-led conservation. And some of that follows that model of this project finance for permanence, where Indigenous governments are there with private donors and other governments negotiating the terms of that fund. And I think that issue of how those funds are governed, the governance bodies that you mentioned, Ebony, is really key in that, to ensure that those are really aligning with the priorities of those Indigenous governments. I think we also have talked a lot about intermediaries, and this is kind of a controversial issue, it seems. Some Indigenous and local community groups would prefer to, obviously they're trusted and chosen intermediaries, but maybe there is a role for those trusted and chosen intermediaries who can deploy funds to groups that are small, might not be on the radar of foundations that have strict financial and legal requirements. And so we've had positive experiences with that in Brazil, for example, working with Fundo Casa, which is a type of intermediary where we provided funds to Fundo Casa. They did a call for proposals around territorial protection, and they were able to deploy, small targeted grants of $5,000 to specific territories, associations to conduct actions for territorial protection. And from a large private foundation, we simply don't have the capacity to deploy a $5,000 grant to a small organization on the ground. And then in terms of direct funding, I think this is really where we've heard a lot about this, at least I've heard a lot about this in this conference, of what is needed for direct funding. And I think for me, what's really key is this process of co-creation. And understanding how a process of co-creation with aligning what is needed by private donors, like the Moore Foundation, aligning some of our strategies and priorities alongside the priorities and strategies that are coming from Indigenous peoples and local communities how will be really key, along with all of the other characteristics of flexibility, of long time horizons, of thinking about how donors need to change to make it easier for people to report, and also what capacities are needed on the ground to make sure that all of the compliance and requirements that our large foundation needs to have in place can also be met. So I think there's a lot of negotiation and co-creation that can happen, and I feel very confident after participating in some of these dialogues here that we're on a good path. We have an open dialogue. We're trying to learn from one another through this pledge and through other spaces, and it makes me hopeful that we can really find a way to have how the funding is deployed match the scale and urgency of the problem that we face today. And so I'm really happy to be part of this learning going forward.
Great, thanks, Maria. And I think you made some really good points that we're going to circle back on, but I think the what and the how are the questions, and the alignment of priorities and co-creation, and sort of disaggregating sort of the direct access and the broader system reform are important issues. Before we dive deeper into some questions, I want to go to Johnson Cerda, who works with Conservation International, but is also the head of the Global Executing Agency for the dedicated grant mechanism for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And really, as it's known, the DGM is a precursor to a lot of these commitments. So I think it would be good to hear from you, Johnson, and the experience related to the lessons learned from the DGM in the light of all of these conversations and how we look at the integration of these issues and some of the issues that have been highlighted by our panel so far.
All right. Thank you, Kristen, for the invitation and to share some of the experience that we have. Can I make it in Spanish better? Right? Okay. Bueno, voy a hacerlo en español. Creo que el primer punto es el llamado de los pueblos indígenas a un acceso directo a los fondos. Creo que se vino hablando en cambio climático, desde cuando empezamos a hablar de estas iniciativas de red, ¿no? Red Plus y todo eso. Todos los pueblos indígenas dijeron, queremos tener acceso directo a los fondos. Estamos hablando que esas conversaciones estuvieron por el 2006, 2007. Y por aquella época empezó la iniciativa del Fondo de Inversiones del Clima, ¿no? El Climate Investment Fund. Y los pueblos indígenas dijeron, miren, se está creando este fondo, se consultó con ellos y dijeron, no, nosotros queremos tener acceso directo al fondo. Entonces, claro, la idea de los pueblos indígenas era que desde el CIF firmen un cheque y manden a la comunidad, ¿no? Es acceso directo, eso era lo que se pensaba. Y cuando se diseñó todo, muchos compañeros dijeron, pero no nos han enviado el cheque, ¿por qué está el dinero dando vueltas, no? Y quiero explicarles un poco qué es lo que ha pasado en esa idea que teníamos, hablo como indígena, de recibir los cheques directamente. Creo que Onel participaba en esos diálogos iniciales también que tenían con personalidades, digamos, del banco. Bueno, lo que hemos hecho, Kristen, en el programa del mecanismo dedicado, el DGM, es primero fortalecer el sistema de gobernanza. Creo que he escuchado acá del tema de la gobernanza, ¿no? Ha sido importante fortalecer la gobernanza. Sin embargo, en nuestro caso hay un detalle, y acá como hay la discusión de comunidades, de pueblos indígenas y tal vez separado comunidades locales, en nuestro caso, desde el inicio fuimos tuvimos el mandato de trabajar con pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales, porque están en el mismo ecosistema en los diferentes países, y ahora les voy a ir explicando. Entonces teníamos que crear una gobernanza conjunta de pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales. En algunos países solo pueblos indígenas, como en el caso de Perú, pero en casos como Brasil necesitábamos trabajar con comunidades locales también, entonces era importante que suceda esto. Este proyecto se desarrolla en 12 países, en Nepal, Indonesia, en África estamos en Mozambique, DRC, la República del Congo, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Costa de Marfil, y en Latinoamérica desde México, Guatemala, Perú y Brasil. Esos son los proyectos. Entonces se trabajó primero en una gobernanza para que ellos sean los que lideren esto, y luego se decidió, pues, bueno, digamos a la vez también crear un programa global en el que estamos nosotros trabajando, el que dirigimos. Y la idea del sistema de gobernanza era que estos líderes indígenas tomen las decisiones de cómo van a hacer las inversiones. Y también el segundo tema es quién nos va a ayudar a implementar este proyecto, porque tenían los fondos ya indicados desde 6.5 millones de dólares a 4.5, ¿no? En ese rango. Entonces decidieron escoger a la entidad técnica que les iba a ayudar a ellos. En este caso, en varios países definieron por organizaciones grandes como la WF, tal vez la UICN y otras organizaciones, pero en otros países los miembros de esta gobernanza, ¿no? De pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales dijeron, no, nosotros queremos una organización más local. Por ejemplo, en el caso de Brasil, una organización que trabaja con agricultores, ellos son los que les apoyan técnicamente allá. Lo mismo en Indonesia, ¿no? Que es una organización que solamente trabaja en 2 países, pero otros decidieron que querían organizaciones grandes. Para terminar la parte de la gobernanza, había un acuerdo con los gobiernos de que los comités directivos nacionales solamente iba a ser parte, iban a ser miembros los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales y no el gobierno, ni el Banco Mundial. Ellos iban a ser solamente observadores del proceso. Pero los compañeros brasileños, ellos dijeron, no, nosotros queremos tener en el comité a delegados de gobierno, porque tal vez algún día nos ayuden a traer fondos para nosotros, y le pusieron ahí. Y todos los demás dijeron, no, ¿por qué Brasil hace esto? No nos gusta cómo está haciendo Brasil. Pero es como funciona, como son independientes en cada país podía decidir cómo quería trabajar. Bueno, se hizo la gobernanza, contrataron una agencia que les ayude para que reciba el dinero que venía a través del Banco Mundial, y entonces tomaron la decisión de cómo implementar y qué proyectos implementar, y esa es la parte de la implementación. Experiencias como Burkina Faso, donde dijeron, bueno, hay dinero, apliquen a las comunidades para que se les ayude con fondos para sus proyectos. Y miren que en Burkina Faso aplicaron creo que alrededor de 615 proyectos y solamente terminaron aprobando 20 o 25 proyectos. Entonces se creó una gran expectativa. Claro, cuando al principio nos dijeron es un proyecto de 80 millones de dólares, bastante dinero, entonces podemos hacer un montón de cosas, pero al distribuir ya el dinero no es suficiente. En Burkina Faso ellos recibieron 6.5 millones, pero cuando hicieron la primera llamada se toparon con que 615 iniciativas, propuestas. Entonces había problemas en la implementación. Y eso, la lección aprendida en esto es que los otros países empezaron a tomar estrategias para que no tengamos el mismo problema de crear mucha expectativa en las comunidades. Entonces, ¿qué hicieron? Lo que hicieron es, por ejemplo, en DRC, decir, bueno, en este ecosistema, en esta zona de acá, pidieron que se reúnan comunidades y conjuntamente hagan propuestas, pero en conjunto, no individualmente. Entonces tenían que conversar entre ellos y determinar qué iniciativa era buena para este sector del país y así en los diferentes sectores. Entonces trataron de eliminar el tema de la competencia entre las mismas comunidades porque les iba un poquito mal. En el caso de Brasil hicieron lo mismo. Fueron a las comunidades y dijeron, miren, en esta área podrían unirse con algunas comunidades y trabajar, pues es como lo hicieron. Eso para un poco bajar a la realidad del tema de las aspiraciones que teníamos, porque si no íbamos a seguir teniendo problemas en el tiempo. El otro tema que hicieron es cómo lograr la participación de las mujeres en el proyecto, porque al inicio, como todos hablamos de que tal vez en las comunidades somos un poquito machistas y tenemos muchos hombres en los comités, y era la realidad también acá, ¿no? En los comités habían muchos hombres. Y ¿qué es lo que hicieron? Pusieron indicadores de los proyectos en donde decían, si hay iniciativas de mujeres tienen mayor puntaje para acceder a los proyectos, o en algunos casos separaron fondos específicos para mujeres específicamente. Entonces, de esa manera lograron que los proyectos lleguen también a iniciativas de mujeres y que tuvieran mayor puntaje y pudieran participar. Y luego eso se iba reflejando en una mayor participación en los comités nacionales. Bueno, hay muchas actividades que se han hecho en la implementación que ha permitido que esta iniciativa logre responder a lo que las comunidades quieren. Tal vez un problemita que hubo era en el caso brasileño, eso es interesante. Había una comunidad, la iniciativa era para el Cerrado, ¿no? Un área que en Brasil tienen definido, ¿no? Hasta dónde es el Cerrado, y de esa línea para allá es otro ecosistema. Habían comunidades en el borde, saliendo del borde, que querían hacer las propuestas y decían, no, ustedes están fuera del Cerrado, porque en Brasil, como digo, tiene un límite establecido. Y entonces dijeron, no podemos dejar a estas familias que son conjuntos porque ellos no están divididos por esa línea. Entonces ellos también accedieron a las iniciativas, incluso nos pusieron una queja, dijeron, no nos quieren apoyar porque estamos un poquito fuera del límite. En todo caso, lograron también recibir apoyos. A lo que iba finalmente es que los pueblos indígenas al final toman la decisión de qué actividades se van a implementar en las comunidades y ellos son los que deciden. Y las agencias de implementación que llamamos o de ejecución son los que apoyan a ellos en la implementación de esto. En el tema del monitoreo, para ir cerrando, por ejemplo, en el Congo también, lo que hicieron es facilitar una motocicleta, porque dijeron, son ellos los que conocen las comunidades, para que ellos vayan y monitoreen, y no había que contratar personas extranjeras o de la ciudad para que vayan a hacer monitoreo, sino utilizar a la misma gente. Entonces compraron motocicletas para que vayan ellos y hagan los monitoreos también, luego de recibir una capacitación, un monitoreo de los proyectos. Entonces las comunidades empezaron a participar en todo. A nivel global, en la iniciativa que nosotros estamos manejando, lo que hacemos es las mejores experiencias que están ellos produciendo, vinculados con cambio climático, digamos, con iniciativas como recuperación del bosque, manejo sustentable del bosque, iniciativas de mujeres. Tratamos de hacer intercambios a nivel regional y también a nivel global. Estamos apoyándoles con eso y apoyando, por ejemplo, a la discusión que se está dando en la plataforma de intercambio de conocimientos en la plataforma ya en cambio climático, y procuramos también apoyar con las discusiones que se dan acá desde la experiencia local. Lo que estamos hablando ahora es, después, y eso es importante, después de los 5 o 7 años de trabajo, bueno, ¿qué viene después? Muchas comunidades dicen, no, pues después de 5 años se acaba el proyecto, como ustedes saben, se acabó todo. Se acaba la gobernanza, se acaba el proyecto, ¿y qué vamos a hacer? Pero entonces aquí viene la respuesta a lo que hicieron los brasileños. Recuerdan que les dije que ellos dijeron al inicio que queríamos tener gente del gobierno para que algún día nos ayuden a traer fondos. Y efectivamente, ahora ellos están recibiendo recursos del Estado para ampliar una segunda fase del proyecto. Y el Fondo de Inversiones del Clima está poniendo un poco de dinero para ampliar. La experiencia de los demás que no integraron al Estado dentro de su discusión, digamos, no pudieron acceder a fondos adicionales, se les hizo difícil, pero los otros, como tenían al Estado allí, como que se les facilitó un poco más esa conexión con el Estado para que pueda ayudarles a tener recursos adicionales. La lección aprendida aquí es que no podemos hacer las cosas solos, debemos conectarnos con diferentes otras instituciones y también con el Estado, no podemos alejarnos del Estado. Y lo que creo que decía Ramiro también, es importante reconocer que todo esto se implemente basado en, bueno, derechos y en los planes que tenemos en las comunidades. Porque muchas veces los pueblos indígenas decimos, queremos que nos hagan consulta. Yo a veces me pregunto, queremos consulta para todo, ¿no? Pero, ¿qué es lo que nosotros queremos hacer? Porque a veces queremos consulta porque son ideas que vienen de afuera. Entonces, vienen con esta idea, háganos consulta. Vienen con otra idea, háganos la consulta a nosotros. Pero ¿qué es lo que nosotros queremos hacer? Y lo que nosotros queremos hacer está escrito en los planes de las comunidades. Lo que queremos nosotros está en nuestra cabeza, podemos escribir en nuestros planes de las comunidades. Estos planes deben estar conectados con los planes que tenemos a nivel nacional y tal vez el tema de los donantes tiene que estar conectado con estas ideas que tenemos en las comunidades para que no nos reinventemos nada y que todo tenga una conexión fácil y que no estemos tal vez dedicando demasiado tiempo en hacer tantas consultas, sino fortalecer lo que ya las comunidades están haciendo. Bueno, esta experiencia estamos haciendo con el DGM Kristen, tratando de que sean los pueblos indígenas los que definan y los recursos vayan en lo posible, lo más directo a las comunidades. Gracias.
Thanks, Johnson. I think, a very robust learning, and obviously you have been at the forefront of this. I think what both you and Maria have said and what the experience has been with the DGM, but also what the donors are looking towards are very much aligned in that sense. I do want to circle back with Ebony a little bit to hear a little bit more about the issues around other pieces of transparency and governance, and then we'll go another round and open up to the audience to have a few questions as well.
Yeah, gosh, it was so great to hear from Maria and John. Yeah, the issues of transparency and governance are really critical. But I think what we're seeing is there is, as Maria was saying, much more recognition to include Indigenous peoples and local communities in the kind of core decision-making processes and systems within different funding organizations, bilaterals, multilaterals, etc. I think what probably the best way I can talk a little bit more about this is to touch on 3 emerging trends that we're seeing through the research around where there are starting to be some shifts in how the finance is being delivered and how practices are starting to shift a little bit further. What we're seeing is there is much more appetite and recognition of the need to invest in local and national organisations to really support locally led action. And you touched on this, Maria, as well. So making sure that there is funding, of course, there for the program that's being funded, but also perhaps ring-fence funding to support internal capacity building or capability building within the local grassroots organisation, whether that's around project management skills or negotiation skills or whatever it might be that they determine what the priorities are. There's also a lot more interest in this issue of downward accountability, and I think that comes very much to the transparency issue. Often we know that a sort of business as usual approach is to require upward accountability, so reporting and monitoring goes upwards to the source of the funding. There's actually a lot more appetite to, well, flip that, but have kind of two-way accountability, so downward accountability, so that the funders and the decisions being made around how the funding is being delivered is accountable to the communities in which that funding is going. And so there's a lot more appetite for that, a lot more interest in having multi-stakeholder arrangements that govern that, and I think that gets very much to the heart of the issue of transparency. The more people that you involve. John, you mentioned around having local communities being involved in monitoring and evaluation and those sorts of processes, and I think that's where you really start to see really great accountability and transparency coming through. And I think another thing that helps a lot more with transparency, and we're certainly seeing much more appetite from this across all sorts of different funding sources, is providing patient and predictable and importantly long-term funding. And again, you touched on this as well, Maria, moving from these sort of short-term cycles to much more longer-term sustainable financing. And again, the more transparent that can be, the more information that can be made available of how the funding is being delivered, being designed, being governed, means that the whole system can shift a bit quicker. So I hope that gives a little bit more of a sense around where some of the positive shifts are. There's obviously a long way to go. We want to see much, much more of this across all corners of the finance system, but there's some really great movement at the moment.
Thanks, Ebony. So I want to go back to Ramiro. And, you know, SOTSIL is an indigenous organization, and as part of the process that you have gone through in the region, as you have transformed your organization to respond to donors in a way, but also to be able to deliver more effectively to communities who in Guatemala, where you're based, but also communities beyond Guatemala. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how that shift for your organization has helped you also understand some of these larger conversations that are happening here and some of the challenges you've had as an organization to apply some of these requirements, whether it's looking at human rights or environmental safeguards?
Yo creo que han habido como varios procesos, digamos, dentro de lo que está haciendo SOTSIL. Una de ellas ha sido primero tener que definir el rol que va a jugar la organización, ¿sí? Al principio, SOTSIL nace como una organización facilitadora de procesos de pueblos indígenas. Es una organización indígena, pero nosotros lo planteamos, no es una organización representativa, digamos, de las propias autoridades, sino venimos a crear ese proceso y vinculación directa con ellos. Eso es algo que hay que tener claro y las organizaciones lo deben definir. ¿Cuál es su rol en ese círculo, digamos, que vamos a trabajar por un lado? Por el otro lado, tuvimos que hacer un proceso de reestructuración interna, ¿sí? Porque teníamos que fortalecer la parte de la gobernanza, la parte técnica, la parte administrativa, que tiene que ver mucho con los procesos de transparencia, con los procesos de planificación. Eso ha sido muy importante porque dentro de los procesos de técnicos se tuvo que capacitar y formar, digamos, hermanos indígenas que conocen de los diferentes, podríamos decir, los diferentes instrumentos o las diferentes guías que cada una de las cooperaciones solicita. ¿Sí? Por ejemplo, si vamos a solicitar recursos a X cooperante, ya tiene sus formatos establecidos. Si vamos a buscar recursos de otro cooperante, tiene esos formatos establecidos. Y esos formatos hay que empezarlos a llenar como los está pidiendo. Entonces, esa parte técnica es importante. Luego, fortalecer la parte administrativa. La parte administrativa es clave dentro de las organizaciones indígenas, porque es algo que no hemos logrado fortalecer. Tenemos un trabajo, digamos, comunitario de transparencia, pero desde una dinámica indígena, ¿sí? Y no estamos tomando ni estamos muy fortalecidos dentro de la estructura que los estados nos está pidiendo debemos de cumplir, con todo ese sistema, digamos, tributario que hay que cumplirlo, que realmente cuesta. Nosotros hemos estado ahorita administrando un fondo, digamos, del FCPF, y cuando se mandan recursos a otros países y se tiene que cumplir con la, digamos, toda la parte fiscal de Guatemala y la parte fiscal del otro estado, Las organizaciones les cuesta entender eso, porque nos dicen que estamos duplicando esos gastos tributarios, porque tenemos que tributar en Guatemala y tributar en el país donde vamos a hacer la inversión. Y eso es uno de los retos, digamos, porque ahí se está quedando demasiado recurso. Muchas veces en esos trámites estamos dejando casi el 30% de los recursos que se van a invertir. Eso significa que de cada $100 a la comunidad le va a estar llegando alrededor de $70, ¿ya? Y esos costos son altos, sin quitarle los costos administrativos. Entonces, esas situaciones hay que verlas. Eso se va a tener que ver muy bien en la implementación, digamos, de los programas regionales y globales. El otro tema, digamos, por ejemplo, estamos en el DGM, ¿sí? Y el DGM, algo que definió es que son las organizaciones las que definen, digamos, y hemos, ahí lo repito, ver el rol que estamos jugando, porque las organizaciones, digamos, las redes nacionales son las que definen el proyecto, son las que definen las prioridades, y SOTSIL se convierte en el ejecutor de esas prioridades. Pero ahí viene también un rol de tomar decisiones, porque muchas veces los proyectos se elaboran en el año 1 y empiezan a ejecutarse en el año 3, en el año 5, y la prioridad de la comunidad dejó de ser prioridad. Por ejemplo, ahorita nosotros estamos entregando en Guatemala kit de COVID, ¿sí? Cuando nosotros construimos la propuesta estaba entrando COVID. Fue en el mes de febrero, marzo, cuando estaba COVID, y entonces se dijo, hay que dar kit de COVID, y los estamos entregando ahora, ¿sí? 2 años después, que yo no sé si estamos saliendo de la pandemia, pero por lo menos ya estamos más tranquilos, ¿ya? Entonces, esas prioridades es difícil, digamos, de verlas en las comunidades. Tenemos otras cooperaciones que cuando decimos vamos a hacer los procesos de inversión, la comunidad está pensando que el día de mañana le vamos a estar entregando el recurso. Y nosotros como organización llegamos 1 año después a darle el recurso. Cuando todavía el cooperante nos da, nosotros tenemos que empezar internamente con nuestros procesos administrativos, y eso nos lleva otros 3 meses. Aquí está Onel que nos está viendo, digamos, en eso, y tenemos a varios ahí que nos dicen, ¿por qué no arrancamos antes? ¿Sí? ¿Por qué no cuando nos aprueban la cooperación empezamos a hacer los trámites internos? Y eso no se puede porque hay un ciclo, hay una dinámica que no permite, digamos, hacerlo. Por ejemplo, con el Banco Mundial, tenemos todo en línea, entonces uno no puede avanzar con el paso 2 si no ha cumplido el paso 1. Y el paso 1 muchas veces no está en manos de uno, entonces esa cadena hay que irla entendiendo, y esa cadena las comunidades no las están entendiendo a hoy. Segundo, algo que SOTSIL está haciendo en estos momentos es no convertirse en una organización, en una mega organización, sino lo que estamos haciendo es trasladando capacidades para que pueda haber no una organización fortalecida, sino puedan haber 10, 15, 20 organizaciones fortalecidas. Yo creo que eso va a ser clave también, no centralizar en una organización los fondos. Tenemos que tener un concierto de organizaciones que puedan administrar esos fondos, que puedan fortalecerse y al mismo tiempo hacer, yo siempre digo, la unión entre el cooperante y el beneficiario. Tiene que haber una relación muy estrecha entre ellos, tiene que haber una comunicación entre ellos, no porque yo soy el intermediario, el administrador, no permito que el cooperante llegue a la comunidad, al contrario, tiene que llegar porque tiene que conocer esa necesidad, y la comunidad tiene que conocer estas estructuras y esta burocracia que no las podemos ir sacando. Gracias.
Thanks, Ramiro. I think you've given some more food for thought, and I think in one sense, as you said, your organization has become a facilitator. You're not talking about the priorities of communities, but you become an Indigenous organization that's a facilitator, and in many ways it also becomes an intermediary as well as part of those processes. But I think you talked about the issues of timing and the cycles of funding that are always a challenge. And actually, I think the issue around exactly how much money if you're administering a project from Guatemala into Ecuador, and it's supposed to be the taxing of what happens in between is extremely important, and probably some of that fine tuning that we're not seeing as well in this endeavor. I want to take the opportunity to open up for some questions from the audience. I think that the panel has given a set of really rich information about how to about financing and the lessons learned, but give an opportunity for anyone who has any questions here in the audience now.
Yeah, hi everybody. I work with an organization called Earthshot Labs, and we're primarily working to identify and secure.
Can you hold the mic? Yeah.
Secure private finance for restoration and forest conservation projects. But I was just wondering, what do you see the need or the role that philanthropy or other government funding can play in getting those long-term funding streams available for communities and nature conservation restoration?
Let's take the second question and we'll allow the panel to answer.
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh Clem with International Rivers. I was wondering, thinking about the experience that the Moore Foundation has in terms of, preparing and working with indigenous communities to actually receive funds. I think we're all cautiously optimistic and hopeful that there will be a windfall of sorts coming out of CBD COP. And I was wondering, what preparation could be done to make sure that community groups, indigenous organizations are, prepared once there are funds available, thinking specifically about the administration, reducing the administrative burden, or at least ensuring that groups, are actually in a position to meet some of those requirements. So I think there's a lot of experience that can be shared with funders, with donors, and just wondering kind of if any of that is in train and kind of what some of the thinking is. Thanks.
Sure. So I'll look to our panelists. Anyone want to give a response or insights?
No, just perhaps to comment in the longer term process of the project. I see the importance to involve the government. In our experience at the beginning, most of the indigenous peoples and local communities, they thought that this is something separate for indigenous only, and perhaps not seeing that connection with the government. So it was a bit, it took time to understand that this is connected with the forest investment program in the country, and it has a great bigger goal. So, and why this is sometimes not connected is because the development plans from the governments, it doesn't take anything from the communities. So it doesn't recognize any plans from the communities in the national development plan. So that's why communities, they believe, if we are not part of that, so let's do it just ourselves. But that's why I believe it's important to connect the plans that we have in the communities with the national development plan. Then it would be easier. In one of the experiences that we had with Luis in San Martin, with the funding from Norway, I think we supported, the creation of one of the units of indigenous peoples in the regional government. And with that funding, we supported like 2 years of work there. And then finally, the regional government is using their own funding in order to provide finance for this unit and work with communities. So, if we link with the government, regional government or national government, in the longer term, they will put the money from the government and it can go for longer. So I see the importance, but yeah, I understand why in the community sometimes we believe we should be working just ourselves is because there is not that connection. And we need to work on that too.
Maria?
Yeah, Johnson, I think that's a really good point, and I'll just piggyback on some of what you said about the role of governments and public funding and what private philanthropy can do. And I think that some of the models that have been used in the past, as I mentioned, for protected areas finance, where private donors pool their funds together but establish a set of conditions, one of which being public funding commitments. And those are necessary to unlock the private donor fund. So that's one way that philanthropy can use their influence to force governments to make some of the changes that are necessary. And I think that systems change is really important. So the extent to which, for example, a private donor can support whoever it may be, an indigenous organization or their civil society ally, to push for their development plans to be included in national development plans, have public budget allocated to those priorities, that's when we get to really shifting the power relationships. And instead of saying, oh, these communities are beneficiaries, it's saying, no, these are citizens with their own priorities that should be included on an equal basis with other citizens in that country. And I think that's really where governments have to come in, and we have to play a role in trying to shift those power imbalances, because we're not going to make progress if we don't fundamentally change the way that Indigenous peoples and local communities as individuals and as communities are considered within their own countries. There was another point I was going to make, but I forgot what it was, so I'm going to leave it at that. Oh, I think it was about capacity building, which you had mentioned that, you know, I think the funds are coming. The funds are here. There's not like waiting for them to come. They are there, and the pledge is really forcing that conversation. And so I think a lot of donors are looking to say, where can we build capacity where it's needed? Where can we work with the Indigenous peoples and local communities organizations where they have identified intermediaries that they want to work with? I think there's a lot of effort being spent on how to make those funds flow now efficiently and according to the best capacities and priorities that exist right now.
Great. Any other question? All right. And I have one. So, you know, the whole concept behind today was reimagining conservation and human rights, and several panels that I've moderated now today, I've asked the same question to all of our speakers. In this context of thinking about financing, what are the issues and themes that we do need to reimagine? What do we need to think about differently? How do we need to do it? What are your recommendations coming out of this session today? And I'll start with Ramiro and go to the right.
Yo creo que hay dos líneas que tenemos que trabajar. Una es el tema de la sostenibilidad, ¿ya? Eso es fundamental, digamos, a nivel comunitario. Estamos recibiendo una cooperación en estos momentos que yo diría casi que el 90%, 100% lo estamos usando para ejecutar acciones, pero no estamos viendo que estas acciones sean realmente sostenibles y nos puedan llegar a dar un futuro, digamos, de cooperación. Eso es clave, digamos, dentro de los planes que vamos a formular. Dentro de lo otro, digamos, es que debemos de analizar seriamente cómo está siendo ese rol de la cooperación, porque no nos está dando, digamos, el fortalecimiento, justo la pregunta del tema administrativo, ¿sí? Cuando estamos hablando de cooperación directa, yo creo que hay varios enfoques de lo que estamos pensando. No todos estamos pensando de lo mismo, ¿sí? Cuando hablamos en la comunidad de cooperación directa, la comunidad nos dice el 100% tiene que estar en la comunidad. A nosotros nos está pasando con programas, ¿sí? Que la comunidad dice no queremos que quede en técnicos, que no quede en consultorías, que no quede en administrativo. Pero luego, ¿quiénes hacen los reportes? Y eso es algo fundamental, ¿sí? El tema de los reportes. A varias cooperaciones les hemos dicho que necesitamos más personal para rendir informes que para acompañar o asesorar a las comunidades. Y eso es peligroso, porque los recursos se están quedando mucho en la parte burocrática. Entonces tenemos que analizar. Con eso no estamos diciendo que no hay que hacer informes, que no hay que ser transparente. Al contrario, hay que buscar mecanismos transparentes que permitan ver cómo los recursos llegan a las comunidades. Cuando vamos a empezar un programa, digamos, nuevo, y estamos viendo ahorita, como le llamaban, digamos, toda la danza de millones que está viniendo, tenemos que sentarnos y realmente definir hacia dónde va ese modelo de desarrollo, ese modelo de conservación, porque muchas veces los recursos están llegando. Por ejemplo, los pueblos indígenas estamos planteando hoy por hoy en la meta 3 del 30 por 30, ¿sí? Que si no puede haber una meta 30 por 30 si no se reconocen los derechos territoriales, ¿sí? Y aquí en esta meta vamos a encontrar dos visiones. Vamos a encontrar una visión que va a fortalecer las áreas protegidas y otra visión que está diciendo se deben fortalecer los sistemas indígenas de uso, manejo y conservación de los recursos naturales. La cooperación, ¿a dónde va a ir? ¿A A o a B? Eso es importante definirlo, ¿sí? Porque la cooperación puede ir a A o a B y afectar una de las dos disposiciones, o va a enfocarse en los dos. Eso realmente hay que definirlo, y aquí vienen temas que debemos de discutirlo hacia el futuro, ¿ya? La implementación, por ejemplo, del post-2020 tiene que estar ligado al tema de la financiación. ¿Cómo va a venir la financiación a la implementación del post-2020? Eso es importantísimo, ¿sí? Estamos parados frente a una convención de biodiversidad y a una convención de cambio climático. ¿Cómo vamos a unir esos dos? ¿Cómo toda la conservación de la biodiversidad, ¿sí?, va a ser el soporte para disminuir los impactos del cambio climático? Entonces tenemos que buscar esas alternativas de solución y la cooperación aquí tiene que ser clave para definir, digamos, estas estrategias. Gracias.
Ebony?
Thanks. It's a big question. I'm just going to say one point, and I think it's around reforming the MDBs, just that small task. It was agreed in the cover decision in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, and the text also recognizes the need to simplify direct access, and so I think we need to reform the MDBs, we need to get better access, and we need to have a shadow similar recommendation in the Global Biodiversity Framework.
Great, thanks. Maria?
Yeah, I think this is a really big question, and for me, I'm going to sort of echo my earlier point and also build on what Ramiro was saying about sustainability. I think, you know, in the foundation world, I'm thinking about, wow, my initiative's going to end in 9 years. I don't know what's going to happen after that. And so understanding how we can best support protagonism of people on the ground to be able to carry those actions forward without being a beneficiary of philanthropy, you know, in a receding horizon that never ends. Like, how do we get those public funds in place? I think that's something that we really need to be thinking about, and the role of, you know, government and public authorities is really key in that.
Johnson?
Yeah, reimagining conservation. I will take the part of Ramiro said about 30 by 30. If we are still talking about protected areas, where we're going to create those protected areas? And in the caucus and in the indigenous caucus, they have said clearly that we don't want the regular protected areas to be created anymore, because that's our land. That's why he's talking about the rights issues. And what about to strengthen that discussion on community conserve areas or other type of conservation, right? I feel like the reimagining this goes that way, you know, how the communities are going to contribute with the space that they have, because there is no extra space anywhere else to create protected areas as usually we've been creating in the past. So it's important the rights, and then be smart to create different type of categories. That's one thing. The second, in terms of finance, I was in one of the sessions here talking about finance, and they were discussing about the fast track, against fast track. Then maybe to move slowly in terms of funding for biodiversity activities. I was thinking that, as I follow most closely to climate change, the same discussion happened there, right? There's no money for implementation. We want more than ODA, right, funding for climate, but we don't see that. And it's important to see the money, because we are doing a lot of plans, but we don't have funding in order to implement. And the third idea there in terms of funding is that, you know, we know the gap for adaptation. We know the gap for mitigation. And what about the gap of indigenous people's needs to continue contributing to climate change or to biodiversity protection? Do we have any number of how much money we need for indigenous peoples to continue contributing? We don't know. We should do some exercise on that in order to support indigenous peoples to continue contributing. That's something else. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnson. So maybe just to wrap it up in terms of sort of reimagining or imagining the issues around sustainability of funding, analysis of the cooperation and both the administrative and the expectations around bureaucracy, or the transparency around those mechanisms, sort of building on Johnson and Ramiro's comment, like the model for conservation is 30 by 30 is not going to sustain us, and what does that mean? Reforming the multilateral development banks, and then I think the communities, looking at the contribution of communities, and I think you made a really good point at the end. What is the gap that we need to fill with respect to supporting indigenous peoples? What is that number? Anyway, I want to thank all of our speakers today and give a big round of applause for all of our speakers. We're going to close this session here. We'll have a 15-minute break. We'll have a quick wrap-up, and then we will have a cocktail to wrap up the end of the day. And I encourage you again, as I've encouraged everyone, to look to the person next to you, introduce yourself, have the conversation about looking at the issues of human rights and what can you reimagine. Thank you. I also forgot, please return all the interpretation equipment. Please return the interpretation equipment. Thank you.